They posted the group photo on Facebook on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind of afternoon when time moves slowly and the house feels heavier than usual. I wouldn't have seen it at all if my neighbor Sandy hadn't knocked on my door, tablet in hand, laughing as if she were carrying good news. She said something about a beautiful family reunion, and how lovely it was to see everyone together again. I smiled politely, confused because no reunion had been mentioned to me. Then she turned the screen toward me, and my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. There they all were, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren, cousins, even my ex-husband's second wife, standing together in a sunny park, smiling like a complete happy family. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. My name is Linda Cartwright. I'm 67 years old, recently retired after 42 years in the school system. For most of my life, I was the organizer, the glue, the woman who remembered every birthday, every allergy, every family tradition. My home was where holidays happened, where arguments cooled, where people showed up hungry and left full. I didn't just host the family, I carried it. Or at least I thought I did. Looking at that photo, I realized something had shifted quietly while I wasn't looking. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been excluded. The photo showed a picnic at Liberty Park. Red and white tablecloths, matching shirts, kids running through sprinklers, folding chairs filled with people who shared my blood. It looked planned, thoughtful, intentional. And that hurt more than if it had been careless. Not a single text. Not a call. No, Mom, we're doing something small. Nothing. I stood there smiling for Sandy until she left. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the same space where I used to help with homework and pack lunches. The room felt colder, even though the windows were closed. What made it worse, what made my hands tremble as I wrapped them around my mug, was the knowledge that I had paid for it. Years ago, when emergencies seemed constant and everyone needed help, I had opened a shared family account. It wasn't much, but it was something. Gas money, groceries, school supplies, emergency plane tickets. I was the primary holder, but everyone had access. I trusted them. I never imagined that money would be used to create memories that deliberately left me out. For years, I gave without counting. I paid for Jason's college textbooks when scholarships fell short. I covered Emily's dental surgery when insurance didn't. I helped with down payments, utility bills, school trips. I told myself this was what mothers did. Love meant giving quietly, without expectation. That belief had shaped my entire adult life. Sitting there with cold tea and a photo burned into my memory, I realized how invisible that belief had made me. I called my son first. No answer. I called my daughter. She texted back hours later, casual and dismissive, saying it was nothing serious. Just something thrown together last minute. But the decorations, the food truck, the matching outfits told a different story. When I pressed gently, she accused me of overreacting. That was when the shame settled in. Not just hurt, but humiliation. They hadn't just excluded me. They had decided my feelings didn't matter enough to explain. That night, I didn't cry the way I thought I would. Instead, something quiet shifted inside me. I thought about the years I spent putting everyone else first. The marriages I endured. The exhaustion I ignored. The way I made myself smaller so others could feel comfortable. And I realized that silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a form of strength. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg for a place in a photo I should never have been cut from. The next morning, with steady hands and a calm heart, I logged into the family account. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I closed it step by step, confirming each action as if I were paying a routine bill. No announcement. No warning. Just quiet boundaries. Then I watered my plants, made myself a sandwich, and sat by the window as sunlight filled the room. For the first time since seeing that photo, I felt something close to peace. What they didn't understand yet was this. When you ignore someone long enough, they eventually stop reaching out. And when that happens, the power shifts. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They were wrong. It was the beginning of clarity. The silence that followed my decision was louder than any argument I had ever imagined. Days passed without messages, without casual check-ins, without the usual small requests that used to arrive like clockwork. At first, I wondered if they hadn't noticed yet, if life had simply moved on without a ripple. But then the calls began. carefully timed, cautiously worded, wrapped in concern that felt unfamiliar. My son asked if everything was okay. His voice too measured, as if he were stepping onto thin ice. My daughter followed with a text that said she was worried about me, though it didn't ask how I was feeling. I recognized the pattern immediately. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because something they depended on was suddenly gone. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't soften my tone or explain myself. I let the pauses exist. I answered simply, politely, without filling the empty space with comfort. That restraint unsettled them more than any confrontation could have. I could sense it in their voices, in the way conversations ended abruptly, once they realized I wasn't going to fix things for them. And in that space, I started noticing how much energy I had been giving away without realizing it. My days felt longer, quieter, almost unfamiliar. I had spent so much of my life responding to others that I barely knew how to exist without being needed. First, that scared me. But slowly it became liberating. I began taking walks in the mornings, not for exercise but for thinking. I noticed details I had ignored for years, the way the light hit the sidewalk, the rhythm of my own breathing, the fact that I no longer felt rushed. I thought about how often I had shown up for people who rarely showed up for me. I remembered birthdays where I cooked for hours only to be told everyone was running late. Holidays where I smiled through exhaustion while others took credit for traditions I had built. I realized that exclusion doesn't always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it's the result of years of being taken for granted. The Facebook photo wasn't the beginning. It was the evidence. As that truth settled in, guilt tried to creep back. Old habits die hard. I wondered if I was being petty, if closing the account had been too harsh. But then I remembered the humiliation of seeing my family together without me, smiling as if I didn't exist. I remembered how easily they dismissed my feelings when I asked about it. And I understood that boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. Protecting myself didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. When my daughter finally came over, she didn't sit down. She hovered, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like she was searching for something missing. She asked about the account directly this time, no pretense. I told her calmly that I needed to reassess my finances now that I was retired. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. I watched her expression shift from concern to frustration, then to something close to disbelief. She accused me of pulling away, of changing. I agreed. I had changed. I was tired of being included only when I was useful. That conversation didn't end well. She left without hugging me, without looking back. Strangely, I didn't feel shattered. I felt grounded. For the first time, I wasn't trying to hold the family together by myself. I was letting them feel the weight of their choices. In the evenings, I sat with my thoughts instead of distractions. I wrote things down, memories, moments, patterns I could no longer ignore. Seeing them on paper made everything undeniable. I wasn't imagining the distance. I hadn't earned the exclusion. I had simply outlived my usefulness in a dynamic that thrived on my silence. And once I understood that, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies that came too late. What I wanted was dignity. And dignity, I was learning, doesn't require permission from the people who benefit most from your absence of boundaries. As the days settled into a new rhythm, I began to understand how deeply my identity had been tied to being available. Without constant calls, requests, or obligations, there was a strange emptiness at first, like stepping into a room after the furniture has been removed. I had defined myself for so long by what I provided that when the need disappeared, I was forced to confront who I was without it. That question lingered quietly in the background of my thoughts as I moved through my days. I noticed how often I had equated love with usefulness, how easily I accepted crumbs of attention as proof that I mattered. It wasn't that my children had become cruel overnight. It was that I had trained them, unintentionally, to believe I would always be there no matter how little I was considered. This realization stung more than anger ever could. It meant acknowledging my own role in the dynamic, not as blame but as understanding. Patterns don't form in isolation. They grow through repetition. And repetition had been my strength and my weakness. I had repeated sacrifice until it became expected. I had repeated forgiveness until accountability felt unnecessary. With that clarity came a sense of responsibility, not to fix things but to stop participating in what harmed me. I began setting boundaries in ways that felt unfamiliar but necessary. I didn't answer calls immediately. I asked for notice instead of rearranging my schedule. I declined invitations that felt obligatory rather than genuine. Each of these choices carried a quiet weight, but also a growing sense of alignment. I wasn't being distant, I was being deliberate. I noticed how differently conversations unfolded when I stopped over-explaining. When I spoke less, people revealed more. My son became defensive more quickly, my daughter more impatient. Their reactions confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. My compliance had been mistaken for agreement. When that compliance disappeared, discomfort followed. There were moments when I felt tempted to smooth things over, to step back into the familiar role of peacemaker. Old instincts are persuasive, but each time I felt that pull, I remembered the photo. I remembered how easily they smiled without me. That memory grounded me in reality rather than guilt. I also began reconnecting with parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I dusted off hobbies I once loved, read books without interruption, took afternoon naps without apologizing to anyone. These small acts of self-care felt almost rebellious at first, but over time they became restorative. I felt less reactive, less emotionally volatile. Space had given me perspective. I realized that relationships should expand your life, not compress it. When my granddaughter called one evening, her voice bright and unguarded, I felt a familiar warmth. That call reminded me that boundaries don't mean withdrawal from love. They mean redefining how love functions. I could still show up with intention without being exploited. That distinction mattered. It allowed me to remain present without losing myself. Not all reactions were negative. A few friends noticed the change in me and commented on it gently. They said I seemed calmer, more centered. I hadn't realized how visible my exhaustion had been until it lifted. This external validation wasn't necessary, but it was reassuring. It told me I wasn't imagining the shift. The hardest moments came when I sat alone with the knowledge that things might never return to how they were. That grief surfaced unexpectedly, in quiet moments when I folded laundry or watched old family videos. But grief, I learned, doesn't always mean regret. Sometimes it's simply the acknowledgement of what should have been. I allowed myself to feel it without rushing to fix it. Healing isn't about erasing pain. It's about making space for it without letting it define you. As I grew more comfortable with this new way of being, I noticed a subtle but profound change. I trusted myself. I trusted my perceptions, my instincts, my right to protect my emotional well-being. That trust became my anchor. It reminded me that I didn't need to justify my boundaries or seek approval for choosing myself. I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was finally standing on my own side. And with that understanding, the fear that once kept me silent began to lose its power. With trust in myself slowly taking root, I began to see situations more clearly, without the emotional fog that once blurred everything. I noticed how interactions shifted when I no longer filled every silence with reassurance, or softened every truth to avoid discomfort. My words carried more weight simply because I spoke them less. There was a strange power in that restraint, not the kind that dominates but the kind that steadies you. I stopped anticipating reactions and started focusing on intentions, mine, not theirs. That distinction changed everything. I realized how much of my emotional energy had been spent managing outcomes, trying to ensure everyone felt comfortable, even if it meant I didn't. Now I allowed conversations to end unfinished. I let people sit with their own feelings instead of absorbing them for them. This wasn't cruelty, it was fairness. For years, I had carried emotional labor that was never acknowledged, and setting it down felt both heavy and relieving. When my son finally confronted me more directly, his frustration thinly veiled as concern, I listened without interrupting. He spoke about distance, about how things felt different, about how he didn't understand why I was pulling away. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list sacrifices or remind him of all I had done. Instead, I said something simple, that I was learning to take care of myself the way I had taken care of everyone else. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. He wasn't prepared for that answer. It offered no leverage, no emotional hook. In that moment, I saw clearly how unfamiliar self-respect looked to those who had benefited from its absence. That clarity didn't harden me. It softened me toward myself. I stopped expecting him to understand immediately or ever. Understanding is not always a prerequisite for change. Sometimes acceptance is enough. As weeks passed, I noticed how my body responded to this new emotional posture. I slept better. My shoulders felt lighter. The constant low-level anxiety that had lived in my chest for years began to loosen its grip. I laughed more easily, not because things were perfect, but because I wasn't carrying invisible weight anymore. I also became more aware of how often I had minimized my own experiences. I used to tell myself that others had it worse, that my pain wasn't significant enough to warrant attention. But pain doesn't need comparison to be valid. That realization allowed me to treat myself with the same compassion I had always extended to others. I no longer dismissed my feelings as inconveniences. I honored them as signals. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, when I felt the urge to overgive, to prove my worth through usefulness. But now I recognize those impulses for what they were, echoes of an old survival strategy. Instead of acting on them, I paused. That pause became a form of self-respect. I also began redefining what family meant to me. It wasn't just about blood or history. It was about reciprocity, care, and presence. I invested more time in relationships that felt mutual, where listening went both ways. These connections reminded me that I wasn't asking for too much. I had simply been asking the wrong people. That realization was bittersweet but freeing. I let go of the fantasy that one day everything would click and suddenly become fair. Letting go of that hope didn't make me cynical. It made me realistic. And realism, I learned, is a form of peace. I didn't need dramatic gestures or grand apologies to move forward. I needed consistency, both from others and from myself. And consistency began with how I showed up in my own life. I made choices that aligned with my values, even when they were uncomfortable. I stopped explaining my boundaries to people who weren't listening. I trusted that those who truly cared would adjust, and those who didn't were revealing something important. Through all of this, one truth became unmistakably clear. I was no longer willing to disappear to keep others comfortable. That version of me had carried enough. This version was learning to stand, not against anyone, but for herself. And in that stance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced to be real. As I continued to live from this quieter, more grounded place, I began noticing patterns that I had once ignored or excused. Small moments carried bigger meanings now. A delayed response, a dismissive tone, a conversation that always circled back to someone else's needs. These were no longer isolated incidents but part of a larger picture I could finally see clearly. I wasn't angry about it, not anymore. Anger requires energy, and I had learned to conserve mine. Instead, I felt something closer to resolve. I stopped filling in emotional gaps that weren't mine to fix. When plans were made without considering me, I didn't protest or sulk. I adjusted my expectations. When my son spoke to me as if my time was endlessly flexible, I calmly corrected him. Not with accusation but with fact. That calm unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. It forced him to meet me where I stood rather than where he preferred me to be. There were moments when I could see confusion flicker across his face, as if he were trying to reconcile this version of me with the one he thought he knew. I understood that struggle. Change disrupts comfort, especially for those who benefited from things staying the same. Still, I didn't rush him. Growth doesn't respond well to pressure. I gave him space to adjust, just as I had given myself. At the same time, I stopped shrinking my life to fit into the margins of his. I reconnected with interests I had quietly abandoned over the years, things I once loved but deemed impractical or selfish. I took longer walks, read books without checking the clock, allowed myself to rest without guilt. These weren't grand acts of rebellion. They were quiet affirmations of worth. I also reflected deeply on how easily women, especially mothers, are taught to equate love with sacrifice. We are praised for endurance, applauded for self-denial, and subtly discouraged from asking for more. I realized how deeply I had internalized that narrative. It had shaped my choices, my silence, my patience. Unlearning it wasn't instant, but it was necessary. Each time I chose myself without apology, I felt a small piece of that old conditioning loosen its grip. There were difficult conversations too, ones I could no longer avoid. I spoke honestly about how certain behaviors made me feel, not to provoke guilt but to establish truth. Sometimes my words were met with defensiveness, other times with uncomfortable silence. I accepted both. I wasn't seeking validation, I was stating reality. That distinction mattered. I also began to understand that accountability doesn't always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like resistance. And resistance, while painful, can be revealing. Not with accusation but with fact. That calm unsettled him more than any raised voice ever could. It forced him to meet me where I stood rather than where he preferred me to be. There were moments when I could see confusion flicker across his face, as if he were trying to reconcile this version of me with the one he thought he knew. I understood that struggle. Change disrupts comfort, especially for those who benefited from things staying the same. Still, I didn't rush him. Growth doesn't respond well to pressure. I gave him space to adjust just as I had given myself. At the same time, I stopped shrinking my life to fit into the margins of his. I reconnected with interests I had quietly abandoned over the years, things I once loved but deemed impractical or selfish. I took longer walks, read books without checking the clock, allowed myself to rest without guilt. These weren't grand acts of rebellion. They were quiet affirmations of worth. I also reflected deeply on how easily women, especially mothers, are taught to equate love with sacrifice. We are praised for endurance, applauded for self-denial, and subtly discouraged from asking for more. I realized how deeply I had internalized that narrative. It had shaped my choices, my silence, my patience. Unlearning it wasn't instant, but it was necessary. Each time I chose myself without apology, I felt a small piece of that old conditioning loosen its grip. There were difficult conversations too, ones I could no longer avoid. I spoke honestly about how certain behaviors made me feel, not to provoke guilt but to establish truth. Sometimes my words were met with defensiveness, other times with uncomfortable silence. I accepted both. I wasn't seeking validation, I was stating reality. That distinction mattered. I also began to understand that accountability doesn't always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like resistance. And resistance, while painful, can be revealing. It shows you where growth is needed and where limits must be drawn. I stopped mistaking familiarity for loyalty. Just because someone has always been in your life doesn't mean they are entitled to unrestricted access to it. That realization felt radical at first, but over time it settled into something sturdy and sensible. I learned to trust my instincts again. They had never failed me. I had simply ignored them in favor of keeping peace. Now, peace meant something different. It meant honesty, even when it disrupted harmony. It meant choosing long-term well-being over short-term comfort. I also noticed how my emotional world expanded as I stopped centering it around one relationship. I invested in friendships that felt nourishing, conversations that left me energized rather than depleted. These connections reminded me that mutual respect wasn't rare. It was just absent in places where imbalance had been normalized. Slowly, I felt myself reclaiming parts of my identity that had gone dormant. I wasn't just someone's mother or someone's support system. I was a whole person with thoughts, limits, and dreams that still mattered. That awareness changed how I moved through the world. I stood a little taller. I spoke a little more deliberately. I no longer rushed to explain myself. If someone misunderstood me, I let that misunderstanding exist. Clarity is important, but it doesn't require overexposure. Through all of this, one lesson repeated itself quietly but firmly. Self-respect is not loud, but it is transformative. It doesn't demand attention, yet it reshapes every interaction it touches. And as I embraced it more fully, I realized I wasn't losing relationships. I was redefining them. I wasn't becoming distant. I was becoming discerning. And that discernment felt like the beginning of a life that belonged to me again, not in theory but in practice. The shift in me didn't announce itself with drama or confrontation. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, but its impact was undeniable. I began to notice how differently people responded when I no longer rushed to accommodate them. Some leaned in with curiosity, unsure of how to interact with this steadier version of me, while others pulled back, unsettled by the absence of my automatic compliance. That contrast taught me more than years of emotional labor ever had. I realized how often my availability had been mistaken for obligation, how my kindness had been interpreted as permanence rather than choice. Letting go of that misunderstanding felt liberating, but it also came with moments of loneliness I hadn't anticipated. There were evenings when the house felt quieter than usual, not because I was alone, but because I was no longer filling the silence with worry or anticipation. In that quiet, memories surfaced, moments when I had swallowed discomfort to keep things smooth, times when I had smiled through dismissal because it seemed easier than addressing it. I didn't judge my past self for those choices. She did what she knew how to do with the tools she had at the time. Compassion, I learned, must extend backward as well as forward. Still, I promised myself I wouldn't keep repeating patterns simply because they were familiar. When my son tested boundaries, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, I responded with consistency rather than emotion. I didn't argue my worth or justify my decisions. I stated them calmly and clearly, and let the discomfort land where it belonged. That was new for both of us. He was used to negotiating, to pushing until he found the line I would eventually erase for his comfort. This time the line held. I could see frustration in his eyes, but beneath it, something else stirred, recognition perhaps, or the dawning realization that relationships evolve whether we consent to the change or not. I understood that this transition wasn't just about me reclaiming myself. It was also about redefining how I was seen. That process takes time. It requires patience without surrender. I also began reflecting on the deeper roots of our dynamic, how generational expectations shape behavior in ways we rarely question. I had been raised to believe that a good mother absorbs discomfort so her children don't have to. But nowhere had I been taught how to stop absorbing when it began to cost me my sense of self. That omission was not accidental. It was cultural, inherited, and deeply ingrained. Naming it gave me power over it. I started choosing responses instead of reacting from habit. When guilt tried to surface, I asked myself whether it was earned or merely conditioned. Most of the time it was the latter. I allowed myself to feel it without obeying it. That distinction changed everything. I also noticed how my physical body responded to this emotional shift. I slept more deeply, breathed more easily, moved through my days with less tension in my shoulders and jaw. Stress had once felt like a permanent companion. Now it came and went, no longer setting up residence. I filled my time intentionally, not to stay busy but to stay present. Small routines became anchors. Morning tea by the window, slow afternoons with music playing softly, evenings where I reflected instead of replayed conversations in my head. These moments grounded me in a way external validation never had. And then there were the moments of unexpected clarity, when I saw how my silence in the past had taught others how to treat me. That realization wasn't painful. It was empowering. It meant I could teach something new. Every boundary I maintained became a lesson, not just for others but for myself. I was learning that respect isn't requested. It's demonstrated through consistency. I didn't need grand gestures or dramatic ultimatums. I needed alignment between my words and my actions. As weeks passed, the emotional temperature in my relationships shifted. Some connections grew more honest, others more distant. I accepted both outcomes. Growth rearranges proximity. What mattered most was that I no longer felt invisible in my own life. I was present, engaged, and awake to my own needs. That awareness brought a quiet confidence I had never known before. It didn't make me untouchable, but it made me resilient. And resilience, I discovered, isn't about enduring endlessly. It's about knowing when endurance is no longer required. By honoring that truth, I wasn't closing myself off from love. I was finally making room for the kind of love that doesn't ask me to disappear to survive. By the time I truly understood what had changed, it was already irreversible. Something inside me had settled into place, firm but not rigid, calm but unmovable. I no longer woke up rehearsing conversations in my head or bracing myself for someone else's disappointment. Instead, I woke up asking one simple question. What do I need today to remain whole? That question became my compass. It didn't make me selfish, it made me honest. My son sensed the shift even when he didn't name it. Our interactions grew quieter, less explosive, but also more cautious, like two people relearning the rules of engagement after a long war neither fully acknowledged. There were moments when he tried to pull me back into old patterns. A sharp comment here, a dismissive tone there, testing whether the ground beneath us was still soft. Each time I responded with measured calm. Not coldness, not withdrawal, just clarity. I didn't rise to the bait and I didn't retreat either. That balance was new territory for both of us. I could see the discomfort it caused him, but I refused to translate his discomfort into my responsibility. That had been my habit for decades, and breaking it felt both frightening and freeing. What surprised me most was how much grief surfaced alongside this growth. Not grief for what was lost, but for what had never been allowed to exist. I mourned the version of myself who believed love required endurance without limits. I mourned the years I spent shrinking so others could feel tall. That grief didn't weaken me. It clarified me. It showed me exactly why I could not go back. I began speaking differently, not louder but more deliberately. When something hurt, I named it without apology. When something crossed a line, I addressed it without drama. I learned that dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. It exists the moment you stop betraying yourself. Slowly, the power dynamic shifted, not because I demanded respect but because I stopped negotiating my humanity. That subtle change altered everything. Conversations that once felt like battles became shorter, more direct. Some ended unresolved and I allowed that. Resolution, I realized, is not always mutual. Sometimes it's internal. I also noticed how others in my life responded to this version of me. Friends who had always known me as agreeable now paused, listening more closely to my words. Some relationships deepened, nourished by honesty. Others faded, unable to survive without my constant accommodation. I let them go without resentment. Not every connection is meant to last forever, especially those built on imbalance. In quiet moments, I reflected on how strength is so often misunderstood. People think it announces itself with force, with raised voices or dramatic exits. But real strength, I learned, is almost invisible. It's the steady refusal to abandon yourself even when doing so would make things easier in the short term. It's choosing discomfort now instead of regret later. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that I was being too hard, too distant, too changed. When that happened, I returned to my body, to the way peace felt when I honored my limits. Peace became my evidence. I trusted it more than anyone else's opinion. My son eventually confronted the distance between us, not with anger but with confusion. He asked why things felt different, why I no longer reacted the way I used to. I answered honestly but gently. I told him I was learning how to live without resentment, and that required boundaries. I didn't accuse. I didn't relive old wounds. I spoke from the present, not the past. His silence afterward was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was processing. And for the first time, I allowed him that space without trying to manage the outcome. I understood then that growth doesn't guarantee reconciliation, but it creates the possibility for something truer to emerge. Whether that future held closeness or distance, I knew I would meet it intact. I no longer feared being misunderstood because I finally understood myself. That understanding became my anchor. It allowed me to stand in rooms where I once felt small and occupy my full presence without apology. I wasn't hardened by what I'd learned. I was refined by it. The world hadn't suddenly become kinder, but I had become steadier. And steadiness, I discovered, is a form of freedom. I had stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. I had given it to myself. And once given, it could not be taken away. The morning everything finally settled, there was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful apology, no sudden transformation from anyone else. Instead, there was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the air feels cleaner, lighter, almost unfamiliar. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in my hands and realized something that would have once terrified me. I was no longer waiting for my son to change in order to feel at peace. That realization felt like crossing an invisible line. For years, I had believed healing required mutual understanding, shared remorse, some grand acknowledgement of harm done. But healing, I learned, can also be solitary. It can happen in the absence of validation. It can happen simply because you decide you deserve better, even if no one else ever agrees. My son came into the room later that morning, his movements slower, his voice less sharp than it used to be. We spoke briefly about ordinary things. Weather, errands, nothing important on the surface, but beneath those words was a new awareness. He was cautious and I was steady. I didn't mistake his restraint for repentance, nor did I demand it. I understood then that people meet you where you stand, not where you beg them to be. And I had finally chosen where I stood. Over the following weeks, our relationship settled into a new shape. Not the one I had imagined when he was small and held my hand tightly crossing the street, but one grounded in reality rather than hope alone. I stopped over-explaining myself. I stopped smoothing over uncomfortable moments. When something didn't sit right, I addressed it plainly, without anger and without fear. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he didn't. Either way, I remained intact. That was the victory. I also noticed how my life expanded in unexpected ways once I stopped pouring all my emotional energy into fixing one relationship. I reconnected with friends I had slowly drifted away from, took long walks without guilt, filled my home with small pleasures I once postponed for someday. I discovered that joy does not require permission from those who hurt you. It only requires honesty with yourself. There were moments when sadness still surfaced, not because I regretted my choices, but because acceptance often carries grief alongside relief. Accepting who someone is means letting go of who you hoped they would be. That loss deserves mourning. I allowed myself that grace. I no longer rushed to turn pain into lessons or strength into performances. I let feelings exist without demanding they justify themselves. Through it all, one truth became clear. Respect is not something you extract from others through endurance. It's something you establish by refusing to abandon yourself. My son eventually acknowledged the shift, not in words but in behavior. The sarcasm faded. The dismissive gestures lessened. There was space where tension used to live. And even if that space never filled with warmth, it no longer suffocated me. I realized then that my story was never about punishment or revenge. It was about reclamation. About taking back the parts of myself I had handed over piece by piece in the name of love, family and duty. I had believed for too long that being a good mother meant being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly silent. But motherhood, like all love, should not require self-erasure. Standing up for myself did not make me cruel. It made me whole. If you're listening to this and seeing pieces of yourself in my story, I want you to hear this clearly. It is not too late to choose yourself. Not at 60. Not at 70. Not ever. You are allowed to change the rules of engagement when the old ones keep hurting you. You are allowed to set boundaries even if others call them walls. You are allowed to live with dignity, even if that makes some people uncomfortable. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my son. I no longer need to know. What I do know is this. I wake up each day grounded, present, and unafraid to take up space in my own life. And that, after everything, feels like freedom. Not loud. Not flashy. Just real. And finally enough.